Welcome to the Social Justice War Room, the podcast where we talk about social justice in fiction, reality, and everything in between. My guest today is one of my heroes who inspired me to do this. He's done a lot of stuff on YouTube to push forth a progressive fandom, online culture free of the kind of reactionary hatred that's choked out so much of it and has made me and many others confident to speak up. So please welcome Dane Whitman. How are you doing today?
Hey, doing okay. I'm making it, you know.
Yeah,
It's almost the end of the week, so yeah.
yeah. So I again I want to thank you in your service because since the movement's really dying down, we don't want to talk about it too much, but the ComicsGate people, the kind of alt-right reactionary people that infected online comics fandom had had taken up a lot of space and harassed a lot of people, and you did a really good job speaking out against them and taking them to task. And I know that it wasn't without personal cost because of the way they go after people, and but again, thank you.
Oh, I mean, no thanks necessary. I mean, I appreciate it. I'm, it's still pretty surreal that, I mean, if 5,000 subscribers isn't a lot by like YouTube success standards, but like, I didn't have any expectations for anything close to that when I started this. I was just compelled and like, I guess I just noticed that there was this, like you couldn't. I would see certain videos sometimes of people saying something vaguely, or slightly criticizing Comicsgate or whatever, and there would be like just tons of comments in it that were like, Comicsgaters and whatnot. Basically, just very discouraging stuff. And I watched several channels start to, somebody would start a channel and make a couple of videos, and then they would get those kinds of responses. They get mass downvoted, and then they were discouraged from continuing. And it's like, and it was frustrating because, I mean, not just that. I also had like a big Marvel group on Facebook back in the day, and I was privileged enough to not know what was really going on in fandom like that. I was just kind of getting back into comics fandom, and I started that group, and I would like just post some benign thing about, like even if it was just an image that had like Kamala Khan in it or something like that. I would get weird comments that I didn't understand at first. Like, oh, they're forcing diversity or this SJW pandering. I'm like, what are you even talking about? Like, I didn't have any context for it, and I would start looking into it and seeing it more and more, and realize, oh, this is a whole thing. uh, and yeah, I guess I just over time I realized that I kind of have a specific constitution for dealing with like abuse from people that I know I don't care what they think anyway, if that makes any sense.
It does. Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, I understand it. While I'm definitely someone who's been sensitive to reaction, I've learned to focus on what I want to accomplish and who I want to care about, and anyone who's in the way of those is not worth my time.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's like, I will I've had moments, some recently, where like someone who more or less we have the same ethical structure and we have like a lot of the same views on things, and they'll say something negative and that hurts, like that still will get to me, like that breaks through. But honestly, like the as when I even from when I really first started talking about this stuff on YouTube, and I would get really hateful negative comments, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm saying something right. You know what I mean? Like that's how it was really actually motivating in a weird way.
Yeah.
I mean, a big part of that is like, I've went through my own toxic phase and stuff, just fandom and then just generally socially years back, and I did a lot of therapy and like self-reflection and working on myself and stuff like that. Kind of like built my identity from the ground up, on my own terms. And that gives me, I feel like that gives me a solid foundation that just that kind of stuff rolls off my back,
Yeah.
or just straight up motivates me. You know what I mean?
Well,
Um,
there's so much talk online about how like there's so much cancel culture and people aren't forgiving, but usually the people who are accusing the other side of not being forgiving have no intention of actually doing anything to reflect on their own behavior or try to change. And clearly, it, I don't know, I didn't know you when back then, so I only know what you're saying, but it sounds like you've done a lot of work to take other people's feedback into consideration and do the things that you needed to do to feel better and to be better.
I mean, I guess it's like, yeah. I mean, I took some feedback, I suppose. But it was really like I guess if I'm being charitable to myself, which is weird to this kind of statement is weird to say aloud, but I feel like I've always been a sensitive, caring person and wanted to do the right thing and not hurt anyone and even you know speak out on injustice and stuff like that. But like because of the way I was kind of raised, but also not really raised at all. Like I developed a lot of toxic traits and just kind of reactive impulses that weren't really grounded in anything except these are like reactions to the life that I've been born into, kind of thing.
Yeah.
um and so that's where it's like, but over time, I realized that I carried a lot of shame and guilt because I knew on some level that being toxic and antisocial and being selfish and like just being an asshole wasn't who I really am on the inside, and that this is like kind of just what has developed due to the circumstances I was in.
Yeah.
And so that's what really motivated me more than anything, is just like, I mean, yeah, there were obviously some feedback from people I cared about, but like the main thing was like I was ashamed of who I'd become, and it was like I don't want to fucking be ashamed anymore. I want to be the person that I know I can be, or thought I hoped I could be, and that's what motivated me. But yeah, you're right. Like there's a lot of on the internet, there's a lot of essentializing. There's a lot of people who there's social capital in it, right? To be like, oh, I'm the more progressive and enlightened one than you, and if I point out your flaws and even just your past awfulness, even though you've changed, that still makes me look superior, and people, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
uh and I don't think that everybody's doing that intentionally. I mean, some probably are, but I think it's just kind of like how these internet platforms, social media platforms, have kind of
Well, we're
wired
all
us. Yeah.
products of the environment we live in, and it you're right that it is a big thing about social capital, and even leftists who would describe themselves as staunchly anti-capitalist fall into this because like not the thrill and the engagement you gain of dunking on someone you don't like, regardless of whether or not what they did is proportional to the dunking.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a dopamine reward. It's a chemical thing. Like these platforms are designed to have that effect. Like it's not an accident. You know what I mean? Like the whole point is, like there was that Facebook leak a while back that kind of confirmed what we pretty much already knew, but just to the degree that Facebook weaponizes the psychology of the human brain, right? Like they pay people to figure out what's the best way to get a reaction from someone. Well, and then the quickest way to get an impulse reaction, the easiest way to get an impulse reaction is anger or like self-righteousness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we're all susceptible to that. uh and me as much as anybody else. I just that's why I just try to say that you're not going to always be great at it, but I think it's important to be mindful of recognizing those patterns and so on. You know, I mean, honestly, it's kind of one of the reasons that I mean, I use that. You know what I mean? Like that's what my content utilizes, or it has up until this point, is like the conflict and the engagement that you know, if I was just talking about just comics and stuff like that and just the stuff I love, my channel wouldn't be where it is. You know, I mean, maybe it would, but I mean, I definitely wouldn't have grown the way that it has, and you know,
Yeah.
because I'm utilizing the same tactics that like ComicsGate and others do. It's just that I'm kind of turning a mirror on them with it. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
where
I
it's like
get that.
this conflict driven and sometimes even clickbaity titles, but it's like I do try to utilize my actual ethics and like, you know, point out harmful shit, whereas a lot of these people that utilize these platforms just do it in the most selfish and toxic and even harmful ways possible.
Well, another big
um,
difference is that uh, while there's definitely been a kind of community that's formed around actual fandom and forced adversity and people who repeatedly show up on your streams, like Willow from my previous interview that I did, and Robo Strange, who you do the Beta Boys podcast with, and the rest of the I Freaking Love Comics things. But it doesn't seem like any of you are trying to be the leader or the face of the movement. It's not like how, say, ComicsGate is defined by a particular former Green Lantern artist who's A, has a swastika inspired signature, and B, tattooed said signature on himself.
yeah, among many other very troubling signs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a weird position for me to be in, because like I was saying a minute ago about who I used to be, what came along with a lot of those toxic kind of reactive behaviors, that was all in protection of a very insecure ego. You know, like and I was just a very insecure person, and did not like attention on myself. That was like actually something I had to work really hard at. I mean, that's the reason I wore a freaking mask and helmet for a long time when I first started, was like I was just, you know, so uncomfortable with like attention on me, and I'm definitely uncomfortable feeling like I'm in some kind of leadership role. But it's kind of weird that you know, I mean, I'm grateful, but I can't help but feel it's odd that found myself in this position where like people look up to me and you know, respect me and value what I have to say and what I do and stuff. And it's like I was never looking for that. It was just like uh, you know, this is like I mentioned a minute ago. I wasn't really raised. I had a really awful family life growing up. Um, you know, like really just awful parenting when there was parenting at all. Um, and a lot of instability and you know, just, you know, neglect, abuse, things like that. But like one of the couple of things that were a constant for me were comics, and just my fandom, my love of comics and like film and sci-fi and just narrative in general. You know, like when I didn't have any stability in anything else, I had those. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so when I finally got myself to a point where like, okay, I'm actually a reasonably healthy adult now, I look around and I see these people that are, you know, toxifying this fandom that like is has meant so much to me my whole life. And to see that, it is really, it still pisses me off.
Yeah. And it's one thing that you've brought up, being on the autism spectrum yourself, like me, that a lot of autistic young men are especially susceptible to being pulled in by these groups, which is something that I don't want to hear from people who aren't on the spectrum, because it sounds like they're just making excuses to find a scapegoat. But
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's not there is a fine line there with like, are you saying it in a dismissive of these people, you know, type of way, or are you, is like in my, you know, for me it comes from honestly a place of empathy and concern. As awful as these people can be, you know, even certain ones that, we might have talked about before we started recording. Like, I think that there is still a level of empathy where it's like, no, I don't regret calling them out. I don't regret, I'm proud of spotlighting harmful behavior, but on some level, there is part of me that's like, I just wish that the right influence would have gotten to them first. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because what happened instead is these, they probably have a very awful life at home. Like, the type of people that tend to be the most vocal and awful online about fandom and stuff like that. It's hard to, my girlfriend was telling me the other day, just imagine what their life's like when, they wake up in the morning, they hate their lives, they hate themselves, and the only way that they can get any kind of validation and like dopamine is to just be on Twitter or whatever and say awful shit. That makes them feel worthwhile as a human being. And as a humanist, like, I relate to that need for validation. I think everybody does, but like, and that's what makes it kind of a con and a grift and a little bit of a cult, because that's the same thing cult leaders do, right? Like, they find vulnerable people
Yeah.
who feel alienated. They feel like, like, where's my place in life and in the world, and I don't fit in like other people do and such. And those are all very common and valid feelings. But then some narcissist, even sociopathic person finds a way to weaponize that, monetize it, and it's really, really awful. And I hope, if nothing else, I've helped a few people kind of see that dynamic and consider it.
Well, I know that given the way politics internationally have worked, especially in the past few years, knowing all the characteristics of cults, all the characteristics of fascism, all the characteristics of narcissistic personality disorders seems to have become memorized just by how often we see it.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing, of course, part of it is, again, due to the nature of social media communication, how everything has been so hyper polarized by the way it rewards different psychological behaviors. But we still, at least I hope, most of us still have some kind of desire to reach out to people and to be able to negotiate differences and forgive misunderstandings. But when you have people who are literal outright neo-Nazis, you have to draw the line. But like, where would you consider drawing the line be in terms of like ideological differences?
What do you mean by drawing a line? Like, as far as
Like, where you decide I just can't talk to this person, I can't reason with them, they're just terrible.
I don't tend to look at things on ideological lines, and I know that probably might seem, I mean, not to you necessarily, but to other people that might not seem like the case. But I did a video very early on in my channel. Like, early on, I had not fully committed to only doing like fandom stuff. I was, I would do some of that, but then I would, like, if I just had a thought about something else, I would just make a video on it. And I had been working on a theory about, once I'd been through my therapy and done a lot of, growth and stuff like that, and a lot of studying of, like, emotional states and psychological states and stuff like that. And I'd gotten really hung up on this idea of emotional intelligence, right? And I mean, I guess the maybe the more, because I understand that there's like problems with the concept of intelligence, it can be problematic. So I mean, maybe the better way to say it is emotional maturity.
Yeah.
But I got really hung up on that and realized, oh, this is I'm still the same person that I've always been. But the reason that my life is better, that my relationships are better, that I, don't friggin' hate myself anymore, is because of the emotional growth that I've done. And that allows me, even though I've always been an empathetic and sensitive, caring person, I was not able to practice those things because I was just so emotionally undeveloped that I was in constant, like, kind of self-protect mode or react mode. You know what I mean? And when that clicked, and it's like, oh, literally the only difference between me now and then it's not that I've like changed who I am fundamentally. It's that I've just learned how to access, healthy ways to practice who I am. And that really resonated in the sense that like once I realized that a few years ago, I would basically judge the people. Well, judge isn't the right word, but analyze the people. Like if I'm going to have a girlfriend or a friend or whatever in my life, um, my first kind of, uh, I guess my analysis of whether or not like this is someone I want in my life on a regular basis or to be close to is, are they emotionally mature? Have they either done this work that I've done, or in some cases people just kind of are usually because of environmental circumstances, they're just already to that point without having to do a lot of work.
Yeah.
And once that clicked, I still look at things that way. It just so happens that it seems like the people who are not on an emotional maturity level that I find healthy or beneficial to others, and it's usually the opposite. The people that tend to have very, very unhealthy and harmful and just toxic, even abusive, behavior patterns, what I would consider emotionally undeveloped, those people are on the right.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that there's not the others on the left. That wouldn't be accurate at all. But like, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine somebody who's gotten to a level of empathy, practicing empathy, and practicing like realizing that other human beings are in fact as much human beings as they are, that they could still be on the right side, as in the right wing,
Yeah.
and have those politics and practice those views. Like it just doesn't seem congruent to me. And so
Well,
that's where it's not like the ideological split is a byproduct for me. You know what I mean? Of
yeah.
looking at things this way.
Well, a lot of it is that, like, to have a society, we do need some kind of basic ideological and rational consensus. Like, we need to be able to agree that people who are struggling, who are poor or sick, deserve help, and that we should do unto others as we do. And we should be able to all, and in terms of like facts, like we should be able to like agree on basic things like vaccines work and wearing a mask works. And with a lot, the way things have gone so polarized, it, for many people there isn't even that. Like Trump ran on a platform of very explicit cruelty, and it's just, i
Yeah,
I personally just can't negotiate that. I can't see someone on that side of the aisle as a potential ally
no,
until they come come forth acknowledging their sins and actually doing the work to get forgiveness.
sure. Yeah, I would kind of like, I guess I would encourage not using like the term sin or forgiveness, because I don't think that those are
Yeah,
like, those are pretty loaded. They come with a lot of baggage, because the idea of a sin and forgiveness is almost has more to do with the spirit and
that's true.
like a supernatural or whatever type of thing. And it's like, it really isn't that. It's just, I'm a humanist. I mean, I'm an atheist, like as in, I just don't believe in any God that at least that's been described or, that I've heard about. Um, but I'm on top. I mean, but I don't describe myself as that typically, just because it doesn't. It's a lack of a position more than anything. So, like, my positive position in that regard is humanism, um, and that to me means maximizing well-being for as many people as possible, reducing suffering for as many people as possible, and not just because, oh, I'm more enlightened than you, or I'm a better person, or anything. It's just like, even on a selfish, pragmatic, cynical level, that's still beneficial to everyone. You know what I mean? Like, you can look at the data of countries that have, like, enacted more strong social safety nets, to where there's like nobody that starves, or like in Scandinavian countries and such, right? Like there's it's a much less of a burden on society in general. So even if you just want to look at it in that cynical, detached view, like the facts and data support this being the better way to look at things and to operate. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I just realized that using words like sin and forgiveness and that kind of binary morality is probably a result of the fact that I grew up reading so many superhero comics, and that kind of very melodramatic way of speaking, including on
Sure.
real issues, that I got from so much Chris Claremont.
Oh yeah, yeah. He definitely had his there's a little bit of I suppose Catholic undertones of some of what he had to say. Um, but I mean, I get. I mean, I definitely don't think that you meant it in any kind of religious way. I just, I've seen people take issue with those terms, so I'm just, I'm pointing it out because I think it's just more strategically sound to find less loaded ways to say it. And like, like I when I first was on YouTube, I made some kind of tweet uh, about, well, I used to have some pretty transphobic and harmful views. Like, what do how does one? And I wasn't like asking because I was literally asking for redemption. It was more of like a philosophical question to get people to think about, like, what does it take for someone to be redeemed after being that way? And somebody pointed out to me, rightly so, that like redemption isn't really the point. Like it's redemption is about you. You know what I mean? When it's like that's really the wrong way to look at it. I think with it's like, yes, you need to be okay with yourself. You need to square things with who you are, and you need to kind of forgive yourself in the sense that I've made these mistakes and I'm not that person anymore. And you don't want to carry that self-hatred around. That's important. But like in a societal, broader social view, like redemption is kind of meaningless to anybody else. It's like you have these, there's memes that go around about, like, especially during like BLM protests in 2020, there were like white people that were like bowing down in front of black people in the streets to be like, we're sorry, do you forgive
Oh
us?
yes,
And it's like so fucking cringe. It's like and like I saw a lot of black folks online saying that this is not what we don't want this, we don't, it's not about your feelings, you know what I mean? Like, just just change and then do the right thing, and you're good. You know what I mean? Like, nobody's wants to take there's it's not black people's responsibility to absolve you of your sins. Yeah.
I'm including a certain speaker of the House who took the knee dressed in kente cloth as if
Oh
that was a
God.
meaningful gesture. But
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's like, this is, you're making it about you, and you Nancy, you need to go ahead and not run again like you just announced you're going to do. But never mind. That's a
yeah,
side point.
in happier news, since we need as much of that as we can, like
Uh-huh.
a lot of what you've done to foster a positive fandom community where people who come together to enjoy these things can feel like empowered and supported instead of put at odds with each other. And like, I remember when we were doing the patron exclusive watch party, the 1991 Captain America movie, and that was a really great experience because, yeah, the movie was terrible, but it
That,
was not only was it laughably terrible, but it was also a good reminder of how far we've come in actually getting superhero comics a place in pop culture.
yeah,
Like,
I mean, they barely got that made. It was such a small budget, and they cobbled it together. And I don't want to discount that the people that worked on it didn't want to make a good movie or anything. But it's just the market was so unwilling to accept that kind of thing, and it's like, and they just kind of cobbled it together, and then it was like they looked at it and were like, Marvel looked at it and was like, we can't release this to the theaters. And to look at where we're at now, where we got like 25 plus, just mostly great films, and it's like an interconnected thing, just like the comics are. Like, it's still surreal. you know, I remember when X-Men 2 came out, and my brother and I left the theater after X-Men 2 opening night, and you know, he's the one that got me into comics and stuff, and like we were just so hyped, uh and I said something like, "Man, I wonder if we'll ever get an Avengers movie." And my brother just laughed at me, and he was like, "No." He was like, "The only way, because the X-Men, they all get their powers from the same source. It's relatively easy in a movie to go, they're all mutants. Now let's have the story. The story can go on." You know what I mean? Uh, with the Avengers, and he literally said this, and I laugh at this every time I think about it. He's like, "No, they can't do that, because they would have to make a Captain America movie to explain his origin. They'd have to make a Thor movie to explain his origin, and so on." And I was like, "Oh yeah, there's no way they're going to do that." And here we are.
Yeah, I saw like Amazing Spider-Man 2 from Sony recently, and I keep thinking about how even though that was going on at the same time as the Marvel Cinematic Universe was getting popular, that they still like had so much time to like info dump like how every character gets their powers, how they come to have these costumes and their names. Like it's almost like an embarrassment that they're doing superheroes. And
Yep.
even though the film only had a few villains, it still felt like overcrowded and like they didn't stick to the actual point of the story. Whereas now there's just like a general understanding that we have rocket raccoons and red androids who wear sensible turtlenecks.
Yeah, yeah, fully. It's kind of wild to compare the two. And yeah,
Yeah.
that was, by the way, that was a really fun time. I wanted to do that because like the watch party with the bad movie, because I mean, if we watch a good movie, then I'm not going to be able to like we'd just be watching a good movie and enjoying it. And it's like I wanted to be able to interact with you guys and
Yeah.
kind of have a good time, even if it was a cringe good time
Yeah.
sometimes.
Well, it does feel like for fans who grew up in that time, we have a literal embarrassment of riches. And when there are all the people who are talking about the fandom being under siege, it's like you want to go back to a time when this stuff was just limited to a few people in an AV room after school.
Yeah, I mean, there are people that they resent having to share. There's like, I don't know. I mean, I guess I feel kind of lucky in the way that like I've talked about this before as a kid. When this stuff was not popular, in the 90s. I mean, like, yeah, comics were getting popular in certain circles, but they were nowhere near mainstream popular, right? Like, the closest thing we had in the 90s was the speculator boom. And that, like, yeah, that some of the comics were mainstream, but only because people were thinking they were gonna, send their kids to college by selling them and stuff like that. Um, so
Yeah.
like, but I remember, I would read comics and people would pick on me or ignore me or whatever, and I would just read them, and I remember having these moments of like identity crisis almost, where I'm like, should I just stop reading this? Maybe I would be more popular, maybe I could make friends. And then I would like read a comic again, or watch some sci-fi movie and go, and it would just connect with me so profoundly that I'm like, I'm not going to do that, and I just wish that everybody could see what I see in this. Like, it was, as a kid, that was just all I wanted was like, you guys don't even take the time to to even look at what's in this book that I'm looking at. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know. And it was really frustrating and alienating, and I know that I'm far from the only kid that felt that. And to look at where it is now, where comics are essentially a mainstream thing. um they're not the most mainstream, they're not like as popular as video games, they're not as popular as movies, but like they're right there, in just inside the window of what I would consider mainstream at this point.
Yeah.
Um,
And it feels like maybe there's some kind of resentment that some people have over this popularity, that like it's like the world forgot that they were being picked on for enjoying this thing, as if there was some kind of valor in that.
well, and that's why I think, going back to the emotional maturity thing, right? Is like, it seems like that, yeah, they probably, a lot of these people that I've talked about on my channel and stuff probably felt a lot of the same stuff I did, where it's like, this stuff's so cool, but nobody thinks it's cool, and they think I suck or I'm a nerd or whatever because I read it. And because they haven't reached that level of emotional maturity, it creates, like you said, a resentment rather than this. That's why I made that clip I talked about a while back, ambassadors and gatekeepers, right? Like there's two ways you can go with it. And one of them is you can be a gatekeeper. You can use that resentment where like, well, no, I put in the time and effort of being alienated and made fun of, and now I'm an adult and I'm the one that's going to control. You can't just come in here now that you hated on me when I was, you know what I mean? Like that probably is part of their, I don't want to say logic because I don't think they really think about it, but I think that's part of like the emotional resentment where it's like a lot of the same people who 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago would have made fun of me are now going to see the movies and talking about how cool these characters are and stuff like that. And so they become the gatekeepers out of like almost resentment and a feeling of control. Like I want to control this now because I put in the effort, I put in my time, you didn't, kind of thing. And to me, it's like the better thing to do, the healthy thing to do. And the thing that's, if you really love these fandoms, the thing to do is to be an ambassador. Like if you love them, then you should be finding ways to encourage more people and people that are just getting interested. You've got like, if you're like, you and I and a lot of these people have a lot of knowledge of this stuff from going back years, you have so much to offer, right? Like you can be a guide to somebody and you can show them something that they might not have seen otherwise. You can point them in a direction of something that'll really resonate with them.
Yeah. Well,
and yeah.
One thing I heard was a description of the way like cis white men tend to engage with fan fiction as kind of like not necessarily politically conservative, but aimed at like conserving things, like fixing the status quo and making sure the characters are like the right version of the status quo. And for people who've been on the outside, they approach doing fanfic more as transformative, like showing potential queer relationships between characters and going into different aspects of their backstories that weren't touched on in the main stories. And since Marvel and DC stuff is basically professional fan fiction, like nobody who goes in owns the characters, but they likely grew up reading them and are doing their own takes, that a lot of the more recent trends in comics writing and the increase in quote unquote forced diversity is a reflection of that. But to me, I think that's just better writing, better storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right because probably I'd say the vast majority of creators who are working on mainstream books are people who, like you said, grew up reading them and maybe had a specific kind of connection. Like maybe there was one issue of a X-Men comic where something was kind of mentioned in passing that Claremont or something that he never picked up on again. Like he just kind of, there's this one mention of something from a character or whatever, and then he kept on going and didn't really pick up on that any further. But then that person, somebody reading that, might have really connected with that, and that became like a seed of an idea in their mind as they grew up, and like that's what resonated with them. And then they get to become a writer for X-Men, and they're like, finally I get to, that one little seed that Claremont dropped, I get to expand on that, I get to grow it. And just as an example, making an example up, but something along those lines.
And even when we follow the characters' histories, like there is a constant kind of change and reversion and change is just in the nature of keeping a title running for decades and decades interesting. And a lot of the so-called forced diversity things do actually play into this. Like the stuff with Jane Foster becoming the new Thor gave her a lot to do, but it also gave the old Odin's son his own arc and his own struggles with losing that hammer that
Yeah.
had defined his entire sense of being.
How exactly? Like, I mean, yeah, great point. Because, like, okay, let's say even if you just don't like Jane Foster as Thor, and it's not even for a sexist reason, which I kind of doubt that that's But I mean, let's just give benefit of the doubt that there's somebody that's like, I just don't like this version. I don't think it makes sense. So on. Okay, but did you check out Unworthy Thor? Because it's some of the best Thor stuff you could ever read. You know what I mean? Like it created this opportunity for Jason Aaron to tell this whole a more human approach to Thor, where he's like, I talked about this with somebody the other day about how Jason Aaron is a very staunch atheist. And I saw an interview or something with him one time where somebody was like, you're very atheist, and yet you write gods better than anybody. What's up with that? And he's like, well, because I tend to look at them not as gods necessarily, like gods in name only and their powers and their status, but ultimately I write them as if they're humans and flawed like anybody else. And that type of perspective has, in my opinion, made Thor far more accessible and enjoyable than he's ever been. And deepened his character from just a super powerful guy that talks funny and everybody looks up to him and stuff. Like he has human flaws, and he and has to square that with being a god, and that's just far more compelling to me than anything else.
Yeah. And of course, like dealing with the fact that his father Odin is someone who literally plays into that fantasy of being God, and especially in Jason Aaron's books is like the most domineering asshole father you could have.
Yeah, I actually have some screenshots from I was reading through War of the Realms recently, as well as like the Thor comic that was running concurrently with it, so kind of tie-in stuff. And there's this one issue in particular where it's super powerful father-son stuff that, like, you take away the god stuff, the powers and everything, this is a story that could play out in real life, and does. You know what I mean? Like with a father who his son is never good enough for him. He's not even, he doesn't even appreciate the good things his son does. He dismisses them. He doesn't, praise him for his growth and his anything. And it creates a resentment in the son, and the son, it almost like motivates the son more to, well, I'm going to be a better person than you, like and I think that's a very human story. But yeah, nonetheless,
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask, since you're definitely staying intention to move away from the admittedly enjoyable dunking on chumps to a more positive fandom, like an actual fandom about people who love this stuff instead of trying to gatekeep it. What kind of things can we expect from that? I know you've done some really good videos so far looking at like the working class roots of Superman and his creators. Anything else that the listeners might look forward to?
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many ideas that it's kind of embarrassing that I have been sitting on them so long. So, like, in fact, the most viewed video that I've ever done, which was really like a month and a half into making videos, was the Watchmen video about the HBO show Watchmen.
Yeah.
And that has a lot of what I want to do in it. But it also has, there's definitely some elements in there of like, I'm addressing, what comics gators and bigots are saying about, Watchmen being woke and it's terrible and this is betraying Alan Moore's vision and so on and so forth. And it's like, and as someone who's, I've literally got a Watchmen tattoo. I've got a document, I got that like within days of reading the book in like 2007. It was just such a impactful book to me, that I've been kind of obsessed with it since. And like, and I, if I went into that show and it did not pick up on the things that I felt were important about Watchmen, I would have said so, but what it did was that and more. Like it took,
Yeah.
The kind of like what we were just talking about, like some of the seeds that Alan Moore wrote, but as like a as a British white cis man, it was from his perspective. Now, what would happen if we took those same core elements and that some of those same perspectives and approached it from, let's say, a black perspective and like a historical, perspective in terms of like the history of black oppression, and and it matches, it fits perfectly to me, like, because of course, if Ozymandias winning at the end of Watchmen, and he of course, sure, at that moment, Russia and the US are like, oh, we can't go to war, we gotta come together. That doesn't solve the problem of systemic racism and oppression. You know what I mean? And it made perfect sense to me that, okay, yeah, he's created this weird, distorted new utopia, and he's maybe prevented World War III, but that's not saving the world. That's not saving society, um
Yeah.
so but that kind of thing, and like you said, the Superman video, the Flash Gordon one, that's definitely a series I'm going to continue. I kind of started with Flash Gordon because I wanted to kind of go through kind of the broad strokes of comics, the evolution of comics. So that's what, like with Flash Gordon, it was like not even a comic book, it was a comic strip, but it was so influential to what comic books were. Like, you can look and find direct influences that Siegel and Schuster took from Flash Gordon for Superman, and you can find direct influences, like literally like where Bob Kane just straight up copied a couple of images of Flash Gordon and
As
added
he did.
a lot, and he added like a cape and cowl to it, and look, it's Batman now. You know what I mean? So a lot of these things that we just take for granted now, and we put these creators on a pedestal. In Siegel and Schuster's case, they deserve it. Bill Finger's case, he deserves it. Bob Kane, not so much.
Yeah.
Well,
one thing that go on, did you have?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a series I'm going to continue indefinitely. I'd like working on that Superman video is the most satisfying and fulfilling video production process that I've ever done. And even when I watch it back now, I hesitate to say this, but like if I was ever going to make a quote unquote masterpiece video, I would say that's it. I'm super proud of it.
You should
pun
be.
intended. I put so much into it, and just that was honestly probably when the idea of like realizing I don't want to do this chud stuff forever, that's when it hit, because working on that video was just such a pure joy. It wasn't worrying about what other people are saying about this or that. I was just like, let's look at the history and the inspiration for these creators, and how they worked from, poor sons of immigrants and got their character to be so popular, and also how the system that they entered into with this character kind of, screwed them over. And all that stuff is fascinating to me, and I feel like we can learn a lot by looking at that process and that bit of history.
Well, one thing that I've noticed in the superhero genre with this like wave of diversity is that it comes as a response to Watchmen and its influence, because like Watchmen has these characters based on Charlton characters who are, of course, like all tying into this history and the sense of like how, it is all cis white men, and it is all them taking unilateral actions and deciding that their might makes right, and seeing the fallout of that. And it's a book fundamentally about a bunch of sad middle-aged old men who, okay, middle-aged isn't quite old, but they definitely have been around a while, and they've tried to make things better, and it has just ended up in a lot of ways making things worse. But a lot of the stuff we have now with legacy characters is characters inheriting those roles and doing something better with them, learning from the mistakes of the past, taking what's come before and making it something better. Like my favorite example is the Nadia Van Dyne Wasp, whose father, Henry Pym, is of course famous for being that one time he hit the original Wasp when they were married, the one thing he'll never live down. But his daughter he was dead, and she was raised in like the Russian underground facility because comics, but she's she acknowledges not only is she bipolar, but that's something genetic that she inherited from her father, and a lot of his behavior was the result of that being unknown, undiagnosed, and going wild. So like her strip, which unfortunately was canceled because us SJWs do not have full control of the industry, unlike popular belief, had her coming to terms with that and managing her own disorder and learning how to live with it. And I think that was the kind of way that comics can point to ways we can be better and see a world that can be better than it is. And your
Absolutely.
channel has done a lot to do that for fandom. And from there, we can push to make more material changes. And it is something that brings me hope in these times. So for your significant role in that, thank you.
Oh, I mean, I appreciate it. No thanks necessary, but it is appreciated. You know, I just, you know, I have a kid now, and you know, part of it, like outside of my own, like I want fandom to be better. Like that's a big part of it, but also, you know, I want the world to be better, and I understand that this is a niche. You know that it's not like I'm literally changing the world, or even reaching a very broad audience doing this or what I've been doing, but like in my mind, if I could reach a few people, and you know, through the way that I analyze media and just exactly how you just described the Wasp book, and like yeah, there's cool costumes and powers and these characters are cool, look at the fights and all that stuff, but what's going on underneath that? What's going on with the characters that are real human experiences, and what can we take from that? And then, like, you know, in my mind, if I could get a couple of comic book nerds you know, to analyze systemic racism through the Watchmen video, or to analyze how, you know, corporations will very often, you know, screw over the people who are, you know, are necessary to make their corporations profitable, like they did with DC did with Siegel and Schuster. If I can get people to think about that stuff, that's a win-win for me, you know. And that goes back to how what I would get from comics as a kid, because like I said, I wasn't, you know, I was raised in the deep South, very regressive, you know, Southern Baptist, just uh, authoritarian in a lot of ways culture. Um, and yet at 11 years old, when I was reading X-Men comics, you know, I very distinctly remember the moment where I was reading and like it hit me that, oh, the mutants are not just, they're not just some fun thing that were made up in comics so that we could have people with cool powers. Like, yeah, that's the superficial layer, but you know, so like in a culture where I wasn't encouraged to think about racism, and in fact, you know, there were slurs thrown around casually in my household, you know, like, and I even picked up on some of that when I was young. Just, you know, kind of internalize some of those ideas. It's just unfortunate how that happens in cultures like that, but it caused me to take a step back and go, oh wait, if I look at mutants, like let's say black people, it makes a lot of sense in real terms. And then, you know, similar thing with like Captain America. And, you know, I didn't get into him until a few years later, because at first I was like, that's kind of lame. I just thought he looked silly. Like this guy wearing an American flag, like just kind of an American tool, basically, was what I thought he was. And then as I would start reading Cap comics, and I would get into some of his infamous monologues and speeches, you know what I mean, where he's like talking about what it really means to be to defend liberty, and that it's not just liberty for some and liberty for all, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it got me thinking about things that I don't think I would have thought about otherwise, you know. And same thing with like Spider-Man and, you know, power and responsibility. It's not just a cool phrase that explains his origin. It's there's something universally true about that. Um, you know, that speaks to, in fact, leftist ideals. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
With power dynamics and things like that. So
Yeah. And of course, it was with great power comes great responsibility, not with great power comes whatever we can negotiate with Mansion and Cinema.
well, I mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. You know, and I one important thing that this was reminded, I was reminded of this not even that long ago. That there's a key. Maybe I read it in a comic, or I think it might have been Spider-Verse. I'm not sure, but like, yeah, the common quote is, "With great power comes great responsibility." That's even what Uncle Ben says in the Raimi Spider-Man movie, right? That's exactly
Yeah.
what he says. And but it's kind of like, you know, the same way that people think that Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father," when he really said, "No, I am." You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of a misremembered quote.
Yeah.
Um, what it originally was in the comics was, "With great power must come great responsibility," and that word changes everything. You know, it changes the intention, that word "must," because if you say "with great power comes great responsibility," you're just kind of taking for granted that, oh, I've got power and responsibility comes along with that, but that kind of makes it a passive framing.
Yeah.
Whereas adding that word "must," it if you really think about it, it's saying you have to choose to use that responsibility wisely, and you have to keep choosing it. It's not like you choose to be responsible one time and then you're just going to be responsible all the time. You like have to wake up every day and must choose to be responsible
Yeah.
with your power, and it's an active choice. But
Yeah. Well, I could definitely go on all day talking to you about this stuff, but I do have to put a limit on the podcast. So thank you, everyone. Check out Dane at his channel, Forced Adversity. Thank you very much for coming
yeah,
on.
actually, by the way, the channel name is changing tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I'll
yeah, you'll
update the show notes accordingly.
cool. All right, thank you, Neil, very much. I
Thank you.
really appreciate you.
You too. Bye. Okay.